Hello, and here we are for part 2 of our discussion on chapter 7 from The Great Gatsby. So these people who have been drinking all afternoon are now driving over to Manhattan, where they can have a more awkward and uncomfortable time in an expensive room at the Plaza Hotel. There is some nitpicking by Tom regarding Gatsby's use of the phrase old sport, and Daisy tries to squelch it. And then the conversation shifts to weddings as they can hear the music from the wedding coming from the ballroom that is down below their room. And what I want to point out at this stage is that Fitzgerald has utilized the move from the Buchanan's home so that other elements that need to happen to advance the plot can happen. And this has actually already been demonstrated by the fact that there was a scene with Tom and Jordan and Nick and George Wilson at Wilson's garage. The wedding that's happening down below then inspires this conversation that leads to the wedding that happened between Daisy and Tom. And this conversation reinforces the connection that occurs, that demonstrates that they are joined as husband and wife. Then through the sequence of events, it's brought up about this particular guest from Biloxi who made boxes. And what they discover about this fairly memorable character who spent quite a bit of time mooching off of the Baker family because he stuck around is that he wasn't known by either the Fays or the Buchanans. This is somebody who was literally a wedding crasher. And that reminds Tom Buchanan of somebody else who doesn't belong and was not invited. And so he turns to Gatsby and presses him yet again about his connections to Oxford. What is the story? And Tom expects there to be no validation to his story, but surprisingly, Gatsby does give an explanation for the fact that he did go and how he had that opportunity to go. And so those who are rooting for Gatsby to not get caught in a lie are relieved by this. But Daisy doesn't help the matter when she then suggests that she'll make a drink for Tom so he, quote, won't seem so stupid to himself. This comment is exactly then what Tom needs to continue to press Gatsby further, and he straight up addresses the affair and says, what kind of a row are you trying to cause in my family? Tom will not be put down, and he criticizes Gatsby and says that the only reason that he has any friends is because he lives a filthy lifestyle. And Nick is sort of taken aback now at this point because Tom has gone from a libertine, somebody who is morally irresponsible, especially with sexual matters, to a prig where he has sort of asserted his moral superiority. And of course, that's pretty ironic because Tom Buchanan is himself engaging in an extramarital affair, one of who knows how many. Gatsby is about to fight back and certainly reveal the relationship sort of secrets and so forth, and Daisy tries to stop him, but that's no good, and Gatsby does come out with it that he reveals that the only reason that he didn't get to marry Daisy is because of his poor background, and he also says that, you know, the only reason why Tom was even able to marry him, or that Tom was ever able to marry Daisy is because she couldn't marry him, and that she's always loved him and that they've always loved each other the whole time, which implies that this affair is not new. It's something that's been happening continuously for the last 5 years, which of course alarms Tom. And so he's trying to get more information. He just doesn't really understand. So he demands that information, and as readers, we start to see Gatsby's control begin to unravel with explanations that reveal more about what Gatsby wishes were true instead of what is actually true. Tom's laughter dismisses all of this, and he knows that he has the upper hand, and the more that Gatsby blubbers around, the more confident that Tom becomes. Tom is the one dictating the action now. Daisy is turned off by Tom. She realizes that this is all just a power play. It isn't even really about her. And she reveals that the likely reason that they've spent so much time moving around, which was alluded to in chapter 4 by Jordan at the tea date with Nick, is because of every affair and then ensuing scandal that happened in all the places that they lived as a result of Tom's philandering. Gatsby demands, though, that Daisy give him something that she cannot give him, and that is she cannot say that she has only loved Gatsby and never ever loved Tom. There has to be some sort of affection between her and Tom. She did marry him. He is the father of her child, and we don't have a whole lot of evidence that she has spent any kind of time thinking about Gatsby the way that we know Gatsby has spent thinking about her. And once she reveals that she loves them both and has loved them both, readers can see that fantasy that is going on in Gatsby's mind start to crumble. This is not what he has been working for, spending his life, his time, his, taking on and accumulating the wealth that he has for this. And further, this fight is the first time that Daisy has been confronted with the exact logistics of Gatsby's fortune. Not only is he most certainly involved in bootlegging, but he is no doubt involved in more nefarious criminal activities that include blackmail and probably some more violent activities. This does not fit within Daisy's worldview. It's one thing for her to fantasize with, a world in which Gatsby is there, and it's another for her to actually follow through, leave her husband, leave her life behind, and live with a man who is only rich because he is a criminal. And in fact, it's possible, in fact, pretty likely, that Daisy has never, ever even considered the consequences of her affair at all. It's only a day-to-day, moment-to-moment sort of situation, and there's no real future in her mind, just the validation that the affair has afforded in the moment. And at the beginning of the chapter, Daisy and Gatsby riding together in Tom's car sort of symbolize Daisy's control and the validation of their affair. And yet by the end of the chapter, by the end of the afternoon, that has turned on itself. And now Tom is the one asserting his control and dictating that they ride home in Gatsby's Rolls Royce, which actually is now representing the conclusion of their affair. Once Daisy and Gatsby are sort of sent off, Nick realizes that on this day, it is his birthday. And this is, again, Fitzgerald bringing up this whole notion of a cycle and new change. It's no coincidence that he's turning 30, not 29, not 31. It's not just a new year, it's a new decade. And then Nick foreshadows the next scene as they drive home from Manhattan with the line, "So we drove on toward death through the cooling twilight." And of course, the temperature change as well is a sign that there is a change in plot as well. Fitzgerald then changes the narrative structure a little bit by writing a scene that is not directly witnessed by Nick. He's mixed it up before with other characters telling stories via flashbacks, but this one is a scene that is constructed from the testimony that is given by a character who is a witness during the investigation of a homicide. Now, in chapter 2, Nick noticed that Wilson's garage was connected to 2 other buildings, one building that's vacant and for rent, and the other one that was a diner. That diner is owned by a man named Michaelis, and Michaelis is not only the owner of the diner, but also a neighbor to Wilson. And it is through his testimony that we go back and we find out what happened that evening at Wilson's garage. He claims that he was napping through the heat and didn't wake up until about 5 p.m. in the evening. He visited his neighbor, George Wilson, who, of course, he noticed was super sick, and he suggested, "George, why don't you go to bed?" And as they're talking, a racket breaks out upstairs in the living quarters above the garage, and George Wilson reveals that he has locked his wife up there and that soon he's going to take her away. Now, Michaelis tries to get an explanation for this. He's been living next door to him for several years, and he can't believe this man is even capable of this. But then the conversation turns strange from Michaelis's point of view, because then George Wilson seems to be suspicious and then questions him about where he's been. And this reveals to readers that even still, George Wilson has no idea who his wife is having an affair with. Michaelis then says that he hears Myrtle yelling at George at about 7 o'clock and then sees her rush out into the darkness from the garage. Myrtle was killed in a hit and run, and Fitzgerald's description of her body after the fact demonstrates a total destruction of the one thing that gave her power, her femininity. And I just want to make sure that I point that out to you, because it's a fairly detailed and pretty violent scene. Now, the last scene in the chapter and this scene are connected on a timeline as Tom, Jordan, and Nick approach the location of the hit and run. Tom goes from being excited about the drama to shocked as he realizes that this is Myrtle. And once he realizes what the details of the vehicle are, it doesn't take him long to ascertain that it was definitely Gatsby's Rolls Royce that hit her. Prior to leaving, though, he's got to address Wilson because, of course, Wilson remembers that vehicle. He just filled it up with gas several hours earlier. So Tom explains his innocence. An astute police officer senses something is amiss with this conversation and asks for an explanation. Tom ironically says that he's Wilson's friend, and the officer is then satisfied once he finds out the make and model of Tom's car and the fact that there were witnesses that say that he was driving and had pulled up right behind those people. Tom, Nick, and Jordan continue their journey home, and Tom concludes that the very same man who has been sleeping with his wife is now responsible for the death of his lover. He is not happy. Now, Tom should have dropped off Nick in the West Egg because they would have passed it on the way home, but there's a lot going on that evening. It's understandable that they're distracted, but this is important for Nick to show up back in the East Egg for two plot pieces that Fitzgerald is going to deal with. Number one, we see Jordan get miffed when Nick doesn't want to hang out some more. You know, it's only 9:30. It seems justifiable that Nick would want to go home after a day full of stress, conflict, and, murder. But what's really important about this is it's the first time that we see Nick reject a social interaction with this particular crew where he actually asserts himself. Secondly, it gives Gatsby, who's been creepily hanging out since getting Daisy home, a chance to talk to Nick. And Nick is pretty disgusted by the whole situation and tells Gatsby, the woman that you hit is dead. And when Nick questions Gatsby, how did this happen? That's when Gatsby inadvertently reveals that he was actually the passenger and that it was Daisy who was driving. Gatsby is busy hanging around because he is afraid that Tom might hurt Daisy. Nick is confident that he won't, but of course he offers, being the good friend that he is, to go and check it out. And I would like to read that last part to you. "You wait here," I said. "I'll see if there's any sign of a commotion." I walked back along the border of the lawn, traversed the gravel softly, and tiptoed up the veranda steps. The drawing room curtains were open, and I saw that the room was empty. Crossing the porch where we had dined that June night 3 months before, I came to a small rectangle of light which I guessed was the pantry window. The blind was drawn, but I found a rift at the sill. Daisy and Tom were sitting opposite each other at the kitchen table with a plate of cold fried chicken between them and 2 bottles of ale. He was talking intently across the table at her, and in his earnestness, his hand had fallen upon and covered her own. Once in a while, she looked up at him and nodded in agreement. They weren't happy, and neither of them had touched the chicken or the ale, and yet they weren't unhappy either. There was an unmistakable air of natural intimacy about the picture, and anybody would have said that they were conspiring together. As I tiptoed from the porch, I heard my taxi feeling its way along the dark road around the house. Gatsby was waiting where I'd left him in the drive. "Is it all quiet up there?" he asked anxiously. "Yes, it's all quiet." I hesitated. You'd better come home and get some sleep. He shook his head. I want to wait till Daisy goes to bed. Good night, old sport. He put his hands in his coat pockets and turned back eagerly to his scrutiny of the house, as though my presence marred the sacredness of the vigil. So I walked away and left him standing there in the moonlight, watching over nothing. And I want to point out this last parallel between this scene to the one in chapter 1 where Nick spots Gatsby looking across the bay at the green light at the end of Daisy's dock. And here we are, just as Nick says, 3 months later, and a very different vigil is going on. I don't think this is the kind of relationship that Gatsby envisioned, but note the symbolism. Yet again, Tom and Daisy are on the inside, and Gatsby is on the outside, always looking in on someone else's life. I hope you're enjoying this story and the construction of writing that Fitzgerald has put forth together. We only have 2 chapters left, so please join in for the discussion of chapter 8.